In countries other than India, India was very hospitable to Jews and made them feel welcome. And therefore, what I'm saying now does not apply to India. But in the West, under Christianity and Islam, Jews were always relegated to some secondary position. There were times of flourishing, but many points of persecution, segregation, ghettos. You all may be familiar with the term ghetto, but its origin has to do with Jews being segregated in their own areas in European towns by Christian authorities. The breakaway and the integration into broader life we call emancipation as a historical movement. With emancipation comes assimilation. With assimilation comes a loss of religious identity. With loss of religious identity is the loss of sense of God. And that loss of sense, now, of course, some people assumed other religious identities, but that itself becomes a crisis for Judaism. So as soon as you lose your sense of A, identity, and B, grounding in God, the religion is in crisis. And the core of Judaism's crisis is a crisis of God. In other words, large sections, not all sections, thankfully, but large sections of the Jewish people have maintained their sense of identity, but they've lost their sense of God. They continue to talk of God, naturally, and God remains the theoretical structuring principle of the whole system. But if there isn't a living experience of God knowledge, there isn't a living experience of tasting, of experiencing, of mystical knowledge, then sociology takes over, communal life takes over, the quest for the unity of the Jewish people, the survival of the Jewish people. These are nowadays the primary agendas of the world Jewish community rather than finding God. So inside this particular historical crisis that's brought about by the particular circumstances of Jewish history comes the encounter with other religions. Now, how Judaism encounters other religions will be a function of the particularity of that religion. And the particularity of the Jewish encounter with Hinduism, I believe, is unlike that of other religions. When Jews convert to Christianity, for instance, they found Jesus. You could call Jesus a guru, but I don't think that's what it's about. So when Jews encounter Jesus, they either socially or spiritually or internally have some moment of opening, healing, recognition, transformation, rebirth, depending on the brand of Christianity. And they have encountered Jesus, and therefore they move on to Christianity. Jews come to Islam, very often it's pressure or at least a recognition of the unity, very often as a consequence of Sufi. Islam generally spread. One central dimension of Islam spread in the world was through Sufi and mysticism, so again they have a Sufi experience. The history of Jews with Christianity and Islam is such that it's a very charged relationship. And therefore, one typically looks askance at Jews who convert to either of those two religions because those two religions persecuted us. This goes along with the charge of idolatry, especially in relation to Christianity. You have the images of God, and you have the cross and statues in high churches, not in Protestantism. And those are labeled idolatry, and with idolatry comes a sense, don't come close to it. Hinduism enters already from the 30s, but specifically from the 70s, with a clean slate. There is no charge of anti-Semitism, no history of persecution, and there's just a spiritual teaching that's encountered not in its village form. When I travel through Nepal and I see Hinduism, it's unrecognizable to me because I've been exposed to a certain Hinduism of the ashrams and the great gurus and one thing and another. And I look at local Hinduism or local village Hinduism, it's unrecognizable to me. What you mean? I've had conversations with people. What, you haven't heard of the Upanishads? You don't know about Vedanta? Yeah. So you ask yourself, what percent of Hindus know about this? That'd be an interesting question for us to discuss with Swami later on in the conversation. My hunch, I don't think more than 20% of Hindus know about the higher teachings of Vedanta and know about the sense of guru. Most of them is a family religion, tribal religion, and the elite or higher spiritual views, in my opinion, don't reach more than 20%. But it's those 20% that the Jews are attracted to. And they're attracted, and here I think is the particularity of the Jewish attraction to Hinduism. I think, and this is the recognition that I came to as I was preparing the notes for today's conversation, they're attracted particularly because they've encountered outstanding spiritual beings. It's not Hinduism as a thought system. It's not Hinduism as an answer to questions. Every religion has answers to questions. Swami gives one answer, Rabbi gives another answer. Eventually, everyone gives an answer, good, bad answer. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, all answers are bad answers because they're cognitive, and you've got to go beyond the power of words. What draws people is the encounter with some great presence. And here we have a fascinating phenomenon. On the whole, I think Hinduism has the highest output of outstanding spiritual exemplars. Now, this is something to discuss. How come? How can that be? Of course, I don't know the percentage. If you've got 1 billion Hindus, it could be that per capita the rate of great Mahatmas is not as high. But I think there's more to it. I think it's a culture that expects it. And when you expect something, it happens. Let me illustrate this to you with something that I realized during my visit in the Nordic countries when I was examining their form of Christianity. Catholics have miracles. Orthodox Christians have miracles. Christian saints, nowadays you can't become a saint if there's no miracle associated with you. So miracles, it's sort of part of the proof of sainthood and very often part of the job description. You go to Protestant countries, 0 miracles. So what's this about? Why don't, there's no one worthy of miracles in a Protestant country? There's just no expectation. If there's no expectation, it's not going to happen. Now, Hindus, they basically expect God to come down upon earth. The starting point is God, great fluidity in the boundary between God and humanity. So, moves one way, moves the other way. This is the fundamental difference between so-called Abrahamic faiths that have a much more rigid boundary and certainly Hinduism has a very fluid boundary. So you expect people to be divine. Either they're divinized or the divine comes down and they're proclaimed as avatars. And so whether or not they are avatars, but the expectation helps to produce great souls. Now, when I say helps to produce, I don't mean necessarily that people just through social pressure create it. I think authentically, spiritually, if up on the next plane they need to send someone there, what's the use of sending them to China, right? They'll become a communist official. So they have to send them to India because they're in India. People know that great souls. They know how to appreciate them. So for what it is and what it's worth, India has this enormous concentration of great souls, of understood internally as God manifesting, but objectively, you can't argue with the fact that they're great spiritual personalities. Many of them, some people feel that today we don't have any more great ones. I've still encountered in my travels in India. I just came back from India 2 weeks ago. I spent time with 2 wonderful great individuals. One was a Swami in Mysore, Ganapati Sachitananda. I don't know if people know him, but he's playing Carnegie Hall on December 2nd. And the other one I met, Madhusudan Sai, who also has wonderful power as a successor, or don't quite know how to say this, to Sai Baba. So, and I myself, in the summer at the Parliament of Religion that Swamiji couldn't attend because he had some health issues, I met Karuna Mai and some wonderful, great spiritual beings. Jews are attracted not to Hinduism. They're attracted to those great spiritual personalities. When you look at it, you see the history, beginning with Ramana Maharshi, continuing to all the major groups where gurus came to the West. Bhaktivedanta, you got Jews at the leadership of ISKCON. Sai Baba, you got Jews at the leadership of Sai Baba movement. I think by the time Jews got onto Ramakrishna, you didn't really have a living presence. You really had much more of a legacy. So in St. Louis, I ran across a Jewish Swami. So I imagine there's more. If there's one Jewish Swami somewhere, there'll be another Jewish Swami elsewhere. And there's probably several Jews sitting in the room now. But in this sense, Ramakrishna is an example of what happens to a movement when that great spiritual personality is now 150 years gone by, and you're maintaining the legacy, but it's not the same impact as the immediate encounter. Amma, you go down to Amma, full of Jews, who the people who counseled her how to structure her organization, Jewish people out in California that helped craft it, and shall we say, to channel her great divine spiritual gifts into an organization that allows her to do her wonderful philanthropic work. So Jews have been at the forefront of all the movements of the gurus, and I think it's because of guru. So I realized that the particularity of the Jewish encounter, of the Jewish attraction to Hinduism, is that crisis. I'll tell you a story. So I was 2 weeks ago in near Bangalore. We were having Shabbat. Does Shabbat need anyone do not know what Shabbat is? Wonderful. So you're all great realized souls. So we were having Shabbat, and I hosted the person who was hosting us. I was hosting him. Well, my wife and I were hosting him for Shabbat meal. A Jewish person had been with Sai Baba and now has moved on to playing a major role in Madhusudan Sai's organization. Loved Shabbat, really was carried away by it, and we got into talking about his experience. So the way he tells it, I didn't want to go deeper into it, but his description was the rabbi ran a brothel and the cantor was molesting teenagers. So I don't know exactly what the factuality of it is, but but whatever it is, they don't seem to have been great. This so much is a citation of what my friend David told me. What happened there, I don't know, but obviously it sounds one step less than a great spiritual soul. And so the role models, who are the role models? Now, I think one of the characteristics of the Jewish draw to Hinduism is what kind of Jews. And I would say that 90% or more, I don't want to say 100% because I've known some exceptions, but 90% or more of the people who are drawn are people who come from non-Orthodox movements. In other words, where a certain power of spiritual vitality, including God quest, has been lost in favor of communal affairs, weakened practice, and they seek spiritual intensity, and they turn to Hinduism. Someone made a very interesting observation. The other religion the Jews like to turn to is Buddhism. But Buddhism has spiritual teachers, but doesn't have typically the same, great figures like Thich Nhat Hanh that also Jews have been drawn to, even Dalai Lama. But Buddhism one goes to for the teachings. Buddhism goes to for peace of mind. One doesn't turn to in a quest for God. So you want God, you go to Hinduism. You want peace of mind, you go to Buddhism. And therefore, Americans have been turning in the quest for God to Hinduism as known through the gurus. Now, what happens when they get a touch of that divine? One of two things can happen. One is that this becomes their life calling, because that's where they encountered God. So, keeps a hold on them. The other, that they return to Judaism. In other words, they've tasted something, and then there's a movement of Balei Tshuva, people who return to Judaism as a consequence of their encounter with Hindu gurus. Where do they return? They never return to where they came from. They return to Orthodox Judaism, because it's in Orthodox Judaism where they have the capacity to encounter that, and specifically to Hasidic Judaism. So one of the main places to come back to is where there is the equivalent of a great spiritual teacher. So probably the greatest among in the last generation was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. I'm sure everyone here, as part of their being God realized, have heard of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe has been a magnet for many of the people coming back into Judaism. But there have been other figures as well who've been drawing them. Rabbi Shlomo Karlebach, Rabbi Zalman Schachter, and others of different kind of spiritual orientation. But it's within. Typically, Zalman Schachter, it wasn't really Orthodox. He was initially, but eventually he founded another stream within Judaism. But the point is, typically when they return to something more similar to what they experienced. So some Jews have the trajectory of discovering something of God through Hindu gurus and then looking for something equivalent. Others stay. Now, you have to understand that there's this. I said earlier about religion having a dimension that's spiritual but also historical. There's also a sociological dimension, gender. Uh, as far as I can tell, men and women are seated here together, if my analysis is correct. You go to an Orthodox, a Hasidic community, not only are men and women not seating together, but many women, in many cases, are barred from direct contact. So I spent Shabbat just now with a Hasidic rabbi in Brooklyn, very dynamic, but he doesn't receive women. So women play a second